Good morning, Alex and friends. I'm Grace. Today is Wednesday, December 17th, 2025, and you're listening to Alex's News. Expect a mild high of 69.8 degrees in Riverside today, with lows cooling to 48.2 degrees overnight. Perfect for layering up if you're heading out. Coming up, we'll break down how the Trump administration's blockade on Venezuela is pushing global oil prices to new heights, and examine why 16 states are filing lawsuits over withheld federal funds for electric vehicle charging infrastructure. Plus, other key developments from around the world, including economic shifts and international tensions. All this and more on Alex's News. Stay tuned. Global markets are up this morning, even as oil jumps on fresh Venezuela tensions. Ethan, walk us through what changed overnight.
The spark was President Donald Trump's announcement late yesterday that he's ordering a, quote, total and complete blockade, end quote, on sanctioned oil tankers entering or leaving Venezuela. He posted it on December 16th, a day before today, saying it's aimed at choking off revenue he alleges funds narco-trafficking and other crimes. ABC News, via the Associated Press, says that immediately pushed crude higher and put traders on alert for supply disruptions.
So we're talking about an actual blockade. What's the scope, and how is it supposed to work?
That's part of the uncertainty. Al Jazeera and the State Department's public briefings note there's no formal executive order or Defense Department tasking publicly available yet to define exactly where interdictions would occur. CBS News reports the enforcement is aimed at Venezuela's so-called shadow fleet, those older, often uninsured tankers that spoof tracking signals and conduct ship-to-ship transfers to move crude under sanctions.
Is the U.S. really moving that much hardware into the region?
Trump has described, in his words, the largest armada ever assembled in the history of South America, which he says surpasses deployments since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Reporting summarized by ABC News talks about a dozen warships, the carrier USS Gerald R. Ford, and F-35s and Growlers backing Coast Guard cutters. That buildup started in early September and, according to U.S. officials cited by AP, has already been used for at least 22 strikes on alleged narco-terrorist vessels.
Did we see an actual seizure related to Venezuelan oil before this?
Yes, in its important context. Last week, so within the past 7 days, U.S. forces seized a tanker carrying around 2 million barrels of Venezuelan heavy crude off Venezuela's coast, the first direct interception of a sanctioned cargo like that. Venezuela called it, quote, blatant theft, end quote, and, quote, international piracy, end quote, according to AP reporting from Bangkok, picked up by multiple outlets.
What exactly is this shadow fleet, and why does it matter for prices?
The Guardian and CBS News describe it as a patchwork of aging ships with murky ownership that switch off their automatic identification systems, hide cargo origin through ship-to-ship transfers, and sail under flags of convenience. Because legitimate insurers and ports won't touch sanctioned oil, these tankers sell at steep discounts, often to China, so they keep Venezuela's exports flowing despite sanctions. If Washington actually stops them at sea, even partially, traders expect tighter global supply, which is why crude bounced.
How big was that bounce this morning?
U.S. benchmark crude rose about 99 cents, just shy of 2%, to $56.26 a barrel in early trading today, and Brent added 96 cents to $59.88. That's a sharp reversal from yesterday, December 16th, when prices hit their weakest levels since 2021 on oversupply worries. ABC News and Orlando's Click Orlando, both using AP data, tie today's rebound directly to the blockade talk.
And stocks didn't sell off on higher oil?
Not broadly, at least overseas. European indexes leaned higher, with tech leading Germany's DAX up about 0.3%, France's CAC up 0.1%, and the FTSE 100 jumping 1.4%, according to the AP write-up. Asia was similar, with Japan's Nikkei up 0.3% and South Korea's Kospi up 1.4% as chipmakers rallied.
What about Wall Street? How are futures looking?
Cautiously positive. S&P 500 futures are up 0.1%, while Dow futures are essentially flat, per the AP. It's a modest move, suggesting traders are watching oil but still focused on the bigger macro track inflation, growth, and the Fed's next steps.
You mentioned legal questions. Does calling this a blockade carry consequences under international law?
It does, and that's why the wording matters. Scholars point out that under the UN Charter and the Law of the Sea, a blockade can be considered an act of war if it restricts freedom of navigation without international backing. CBS News quoted Representative Joaquin Castro calling it, quote, unquestionably an act of war, end quote, while Al Jazeera noted the UN's, quote, grave concern, end quote, and the OAS Secretary General's call to de-escalate.
Without clear orders on paper, what authority is Washington citing?
Two pillars. One is the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, which lets the Treasury's OFAC enforce sanctions, including designating ships, owners, and facilitators. The other is Commander-in-Chief Authority, which the administration argues allows naval support for sanctions enforcement, though there's no UN Security Council mandate, as NPR and legal analysts have pointed out in similar past cases.
Trump went even further and labeled Maduro's regime a foreign terrorist organization. Is that official?
The State Department had already designated the Cartel de los Soles as a foreign terrorist organization on November 24th, just over 3 weeks ago, and Treasury named it a specially designated global terrorist entity in July. Trump's post called the regime itself a foreign terrorist organization, a framing that pushes beyond the formal listing but signals a maximalist approach. The Washington Post and CBS explain that U.S. indictments going back to 2020 accuse Maduro and allies of drug trafficking ties and offer rewards for their arrest.
How is Caracas responding?
With fierce rejection and legal threats, Venezuelan officials called the order a, quote, grotesque threat, end quote, and vowed to challenge it at the UN and other bodies, denying the narco-terrorism allegations as, quote, a ridiculous fabrication, end quote. El País reports they're also rallying regional allies, framing the move as an attack on sovereignty and free navigation.
There's also a long-running fight over oil assets. How does that figure in?
It's central to the rhetoric. Trump demanded the return of, quote, all of the oil, land, and other assets that they previously stole from us, end quote, a reference to Venezuela's 2007 nationalizations under Hugo Chavez. ConocoPhillips won an arbitration award of roughly $8.7 billion plus interest, upheld back in January of this year, but Caracas hasn't paid, and OFAC has been authorizing enforcement actions and asset freezes tied to PDVSA since 2017 and especially 2019, per The Guardian and CBS.
If interdictions happen, where would they likely occur?
Officials haven't spelled that out, and that's the risk. The AP says interdictions would likely take place in international waters of the Caribbean and Eastern Pacific, where the Shadow Fleet transits. Pushing into Venezuela's exclusive economic zone or territorial waters would be a much bigger escalation, which is why maritime notices like Navadmins and notices to mariners are being watched so closely.
You mentioned chips lifting Asia. What else stood out on those boards?
South Korea's rally hinged on SK Hynix up about 4%, and Samsung Electronics up 5%, AP's regional roundup noted. Hong Kong's Hang Seng gained close to 0.9%, while Shanghai rose 1.2%. And Japan's market was supported by November export growth, up 6% year-over-year, with a U.S.-Japan tariff deal helping, according to Japan Today. Australia's ASX slipped 0.2%, bucking the trend.
And U.S. markets yesterday were choppy. What were the closing numbers?
The S&P 500 eased 0.2% and is still hovering near last week's record, while the Dow fell 0.6% and the Nasdaq added 0.2%. Japan Today, citing AP, says investors were sorting through a mixed picture: the worst U.S. jobless rate since 2021, but stronger than expected payroll gains and solid October retail. S&P Global also reported business activity slowing to the weakest since June, even as prices rose at the fastest pace since mid-2022.
Is the Fed still the linchpin for the next leg?
Absolutely. Traders are gaming out rate cuts in 2026, but they're watching Thursday's inflation report, 2 days from now, for confirmation that price pressures are easing. Click Orlando's AP coverage says any upside surprise on inflation could temper the rally, especially with oil moving higher.
Tech stocks keep driving this tape. Are there worries under the surface?
There are. While names like Oracle and Broadcom bounced, Oracle was up about 2% and Broadcom 0.4% after wobbling Japan. Today notes investor doubts about whether massive AI spending will deliver profits quickly, with CoreWeave falling nearly 4% as a sign of that skepticism. It's part of why gains are uneven, even on a green day.
How's the dollar reacting to all this?
Stronger, which is typical in risk-off or geopolitically tense moments. The dollar rose to about 155 yen and 48 sen from 154.73, and the euro slipped to $1.1717 from $1.1748. ABC News attributes the move to haven flows and the rate differential narrative that still favors the dollar.
Circling back, what does this mean for Venezuela's oil exports in the near term?
If the U.S. truly clamps down on the shadow fleet, Venezuela's exports could fall from already depressed levels, tightening heavy crude supply and complicating blends for some refiners. PDVSA has leaned on opaque intermediaries since losing access to mainstream insurers and shippers, so the friction is already high. Any added risk premium could show up in physical differentials and freight rates, as analysts told AP.
Are we likely to see immediate legal challenges from shippers or insurers?
Probably not in the first days, because many of these vessels are uninsured or lightly insured through non-Western entities. But ship owners and flag states could push back if interdictions snag foreign-flagged vessels in international waters without clear legal backing. Maritime lawyers told The Guardian that clarity on interdiction zones will be the first test.
What's the regional diplomatic temperature right now?
Tepid to tense, the UN urged dialogue and expressed, quote, grave concern, end quote, and the OAS chief called for de-escalation, according to Al Jazeera's summary of official statements. Several Latin American governments are wary of any spillover, mindful of the Cuban quarantine precedent in 1962, which had OAS backing that this move conspicuously lacks.
Could U.S. allies support or join enforcement?
Not immediately. There's no sign of a coalition mandate, and European governments seem focused on energy stability rather than new naval commitments, as the Financial Times and CBC.ca have suggested in similar episodes. Without UN or OAS cover, it's politically fraught for partners to participate.
What about the human angle? Does this ratchet up migration pressures?
Potentially, yes. Analysts told AA.com.tr that tighter oil revenues and heightened tensions could worsen Venezuela's economic strain, adding to outward pressure. Any escalation that further curtails exports tends to ripple through domestic shortages and inflation inside the country.
Are there risks of miscalculation at sea?
That's the nightmare scenario. Close quarters interdictions in busy lanes, opaque ownership, and possible involvement of third country crews raise the odds of an incident, especially if communications are murky. Veteran naval officers told AP that rules of engagement and clearly published notices are essential to avoid a dangerous misunderstanding.
If prices stay elevated, who benefits and who hurts?
U.S. shale producers and heavy crude suppliers like Mexico and Canada could benefit from firmer benchmarks and tighter heavy grades. Import-reliant economies in Asia would feel the pinch, especially where refiners are configured for heavier blends. For consumers, higher pump prices would depend on how long the premium lasts and whether the dollar keeps climbing.
Are we seeing any sign this is a negotiating gambit rather than a sustained operation?
It's possible. The absence of a formal, detailed directive suggests Washington may be testing reactions while leveraging existing sanctions tools, which OFAC can dial up quickly by naming ships and intermediaries. The Washington Post notes past U.S. practice often uses early saber-rattling to drive back-channel talks, though Caracas so far is digging in.
If you're an investor this morning, what's the simple takeaway?
Expect more volatility in energy and shipping. While broader equities keep trading the macro, rates, growth, and earnings. The legal fog around the blockade adds headline risk, which can swing prices on each new notice, sanction designation, or interception. For now, markets are treating it as a supply risk, not a broader war risk.
We'll leave it there for now. Ethan, thanks for the perspective.
Thanks, Grace.
Welcome back. A coalition of states just sued the Trump administration over frozen EV charging funds. Chloe's here to break down what's at stake and why. Hey, Chloe.
Hey Grace, this is a big, fast-moving fight over money Congress already set aside. Yesterday, December 16th, a group of 16 Democratic-led states, plus D.C. and Pennsylvania's Governor, Josh Shapiro, filed suit in federal court in Seattle. They're targeting the Transportation Department and the Federal Highway Administration for what they call unlawful impoundment of more than $2 billion meant for EV charging.
What exactly are these funds for? And who would benefit?
2 grant programs are at the heart of it. One is the Charging and Fueling Infrastructure, or CFI, grant program, with about $1.8 billion for EV and alternative fuel charging in communities and along corridors. The other is the Electric Vehicle Charger Reliability and Accessibility Accelerator, roughly $350 million aimed at fixing and upgrading chargers, especially in underserved areas. According to CNBC and ABC News, a lot of awards were announced months ago, but the feds haven't executed the grant agreements.
How long has the money been on hold?
The states say DOT and FHWA stopped approving new funding or signing agreements in the spring. That's left most awards stranded on paper. California is waiting on $179.8 million, Massachusetts on $14.4 million, and New York on nearly $15 million, as reported by the Philadelphia Inquirer this morning. Projects from cities and tribes are stuck too, with advocates saying more than 140 grants are in limbo.
Who's leading the lawsuit? And what are they arguing?
California Attorney General Rob Bonta and Colorado's Phil Weiser are leading the charge, and Governor Shapiro joined directly, sidestepping Pennsylvania's Republican-led AG's office. They argue the freeze violates the Impoundment Control Act of 1974, the Administrative Procedure Act, and separation of powers. In their view, Congress obligated this money in the bipartisan infrastructure law, and agencies can't withhold it just because policy priorities changed. The Washington Post has noted similar arguments in earlier battles over Biden-era programs.
Did Bonta or others say anything notable?
Bonta pulled no punches. He said, quote, "The Trump administration's illegal attempt to stop funding for electric vehicle infrastructure must come to an end. This is just another reckless attempt that will stall the fight against air pollution and climate change, slow innovation, thwart green job creation, and leave communities without access to clean, affordable transportation." End quote. That statement was carried by CNBC and the AP's Alexa St. John for ABC News yesterday. As of this morning, Bloomberg Law and E&E News say DOT hasn't commented.
How does this connect to earlier fights over EV money?
It's part of a pattern. Back in May, several of these states sued over the separate EV highway charging program, which totals $5 billion. A Seattle federal judge, Tana Lin, issued a preliminary injunction on June 24th, saying the freeze was likely unlawful. According to CNBC's coverage of that case, DOT then revised guidance, and NEVI awards started flowing to places like Georgia, Illinois, Maryland, and Wisconsin.
So this new case is different programs, same issue?
Exactly. NEVI is the formula program for highway corridors. This suit focuses on competitive grants, the CFI, and the accelerator pot, much of which remains unobligated despite public award announcements. The plaintiffs say the agencies haven't filed the required notices to Congress if they're deferring or rescinding, which the 1974 impoundment law requires. Pacer Monitor and Courthouse News Service note no judge has been assigned yet, which is common the day after filing.
Is there a request for an immediate injunction here?
Not yet on the docket as of this morning, the complaint asks for declaratory and injunctive relief to compel release, and it points to Judge Lin's prior injunction as a model for quick action. But Politico Pro and Bloomberg Law report no temporary restraining order or preliminary injunction motion has been confirmed filed as of today. That could change quickly, given how time-sensitive construction seasons can be.
What's the administration's legal position likely to be?
In similar disputes, the administration's lawyers have invoked the Tucker Act, arguing these are contract payment fights that belong in the Court of Federal Claims. Law firm analyses flagged Supreme Court shadow docket orders in 2025 that seemed receptive to that framing. But the states say this isn't a vendor payment claim, it's an agency action challenge under the APA. Lawfare and the Bipartisan Policy Center have both explained how that distinction can determine which court hears the case.
Step back for us. Why were these funds created in the first place?
Congress set them up in the 2021 Bipartisan Infrastructure Law to build out charging, improve reliability, and expand access. The goal was to cut tailpipe pollution, meet climate targets, and spur jobs in battery and charging tech. The $1.8 billion for CFI is part of a larger $2.5 billion pot, with the accelerator carved out from the $5 billion in EVI program. E&E News has emphasized the equity piece, especially for rural and low-income communities that often get left behind.
What changed after President Trump took office again in January?
In February, he signed an executive order called Unleashing American Energy. It told agencies to pause disbursements from the Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act for EV programs while they reviewed everything. The order framed it as ending what he called an EV mandate, even though Biden's approach used emission standards and incentives rather than a literal sales mandate. The Los Angeles Times and the Washington Post have tracked subsequent rollbacks, including proposals to weaken tailpipe rules and speed up fossil fuel projects.
Didn't Congress also change EV incentives this fall?
Yes, Republicans pushed through repeal of the up to $7.500 federal tax credit for many EVs in the fall, which undercut demand-side support. According to ABC News and The Inquirer, that's one reason EV sales growth is cooling. Kelley Blue Book data cited by those outlets shows average EV prices were about $58,600 last month versus nearly $49,800 for all vehicles. Without credits and with fewer chargers, adoption gets tougher.
How's the EV market reacting more broadly?
Automakers are recalibrating. Ford said this week it's shifting focus from some big EV bets to hybrids and efficient gas models. Honda scaled back certain EV plans in spring 2025. NPR and CNBC have both reported that companies still see long-term electrification, but near-term investments hinge on charging reliability, policy certainty, and consumer incentives.
What are environmental groups doing in parallel?
They've filed their own lawsuit to unfreeze nearly $1.8 billion for local and tribal CFI projects. The Guardian and SFGate highlighted that Earthjustice is coordinating some of that effort. Vermont Biz has covered how small towns and rural co-ops view these funds as essential for equitable access. Those suits echo the state's argument that you can't hold money back just because the White House dislikes the underlying policy.
Legally, how strong is the state's impoundment argument?
The Impoundment Control Act is pretty clear about the process. If an administration wants to defer or rescind spending, it has to notify Congress and justify it. GAO guidance allows programmatic delays for operational reasons, like a contractor failing or environmental reviews taking time. But Lawfare notes the explicit policy aims in the Unleashing American Energy order make it harder to claim this is purely operational.
Remind us what happened in the earlier NEVI ruling.
Judge Lin found the freeze likely unlawful and ordered much of the money released while the case continued. After that, Transportation Secretary Sean Duffy issued new guidance to speed up approvals. CNBC quoted EV analyst Loren McDonald saying awards did start moving in at least 4 states. This new suit argues the same logic should apply to CFI and the accelerator, which remains stuck.
Any signs of who will hear the new case or how fast it moves?
No presiding judge has been assigned yet, which isn't unusual the day after filing. Courthouse News reports the docket number is 225 CVO 2574 in the Western District of Washington. If the plaintiffs file for a preliminary injunction, we could see a hearing date set within weeks. Timing matters because many projects need to line up equipment and crews well ahead of spring.
What does the administration say about the policy rationale?
Officially, not much so far. Reporters from the Washington Post, E&E News, and RTO Insider have all noted the lack of a detailed justification beyond the broad energy order. The administration argues it's rebalancing toward domestic oil and gas, and away from what it calls ideologically motivated regulations. But without formal deferral messages to Congress, that stance is on shaky impoundment ground, according to Bipartisan Policy Center experts.
What happens on the ground if the freeze continues?
States may delay or cancel planned sites, especially in communities without private investment. That risks widening charging deserts, which discourages buyers and keeps older, higher-polluting vehicles on the road longer. Public power utilities and smaller cities can't easily replace nine-figure federal grants. The AP has quoted local officials warning of lost construction seasons and higher future costs.
Could private networks fill the gap?
Some, but not enough, and not equitably. The business case is strongest in dense or affluent areas, so rural and low-income neighborhoods get last dibs. That's why Congress designed these programs to fund highway corridors and community chargers together. E&E News says the accelerator funds were especially targeted at broken or inaccessible stations that undermine confidence.
What are the broader climate and economic stakes?
Every year of delay makes hitting state and federal climate targets harder, especially with transportation as the top U.S. emissions source. The Philadelphia Inquirer notes the lost time also stalls job growth in installation, software, and maintenance tied to charging. Meanwhile, globally, EV adoption is still climbing, and analysts worry the U.S. could cede leadership. New York and Massachusetts AGs argue the freeze undercuts homegrown innovation in batteries and power electronics.
How might the court resolve the jurisdiction fight you mentioned?
If the judge accepts the Tucker Act view, parts could be shunted to the Court of Federal Claims, treating them like contract payment disputes. But if the court sees a broader APA challenge to agency policy, it'll keep it and review the freeze as a final agency action. Lawfare explains that courts often look at whether the relief sought is to compel lawful decision-making, not just to pay invoices. The plaintiffs are clearly aiming for that broader frame.
What should listeners watch for next?
First, whether the states file for a preliminary injunction, and how quickly a judge is assigned. Second, any move by DOT to issue formal deferral notices to Congress, which would signal a shift to a more defensible process. Third, signs of partial releases, like DOT quietly executing some agreements to blunt the legal risk. Politico Pro notes that kind of incremental action followed the NIVI injunction.
Bottom line, what's different about this fight compared to earlier energy policy battles?
This isn't just about setting new rules. It's about whether a White House can sideline funding Congress already obligated without following the law's guardrails. The Nixon-era impoundment battles birthed the 1974 Act for exactly this reason. As NPR and the Bipartisan Policy Center have both said, the stakes go beyond EVs to core separation of powers questions. And in the meantime, chargers aren't getting built.
Chloe, great context as always. Thanks for walking us through it.
Thanks, Grace. We'll keep an eye on the docket and any DOT moves.
Appreciate it. That's our look at the EV funding lawsuit, filed yesterday and already shaping the electric road ahead. Here are some other headlines. The Trump administration's travel policy takes flight with a bigger no-fly list, an expanded ban adding 20 new countries and holders of Palestinian Authority travel documents, bringing the total tally to 39. Full entry bans land on Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, South Sudan, and Syria, while Laos and Sierra Leone are upgraded from partial to full stop. Partial restrictions, clipping immigrant visas and some business or student visas, now cover Angola, Antigua and Barbuda, Benin, Côte d'Ivoire, Dominica, Gabon, the Gambia, Malawi, Mauritania, Nigeria, Senegal, Tanzania, Tonga, Zambia, and Zimbabwe. The proclamation wheels up January 1, 2026. Officials cite severe deficiencies in information sharing and last month's case of an Afghan national charged in the shooting of 2 National Guard troops as the spark. The move doubles down on Africa. 16 of the 20 ads are on the continent and could jam airports and inboxes for universities, businesses, and families. Legally, it taxis on Supreme Court precedent that cleared the runway for presidential entry restrictions, potentially grounding challenges. In Berlin, a peace plan with pedals and brakes. President Volodymyr Zelensky says U.S. negotiated proposals are very workable, with roughly 90% consensus, including security guarantees that echo NATO's Article 5, yet the gears grind over Russian-occupied territories. A free economic zone concept for Donbass is on the drafting table, though Kyiv stresses it's not a concession of control. The U.S. aims to put text before Moscow within days, opening the door to stateside meetings as soon as next weekend. The Kremlin, however, signals it won't buy a temporary truce that dodges its core demands. It's diplomacy at sprint speed, trying to cross the finish line before the year's clock runs out. On the nuclear front, a regulatory shockwave. The administration's reactor pilot program would let the Department of Energy self-regulate test reactors on federal land, sidestepping the Nuclear Regulatory Commission for the pilot phase, with a target launch by July 4, 2026. Critics, from the Union of Concerned Scientists to former NRC Chair Alison McFarlane, warn that cutting out an independent referee in a high-stakes game is courting a meltdown of trust. Backers counter that fast-tracking is the only way to keep pace globally and feed power-hungry data centers and AI. The split screen, speed versus safety, innovation versus inspection, atoms up or atoms out. In Doha, a security jigsaw without the corner pieces. After a CENTCOM-led conference, Washington is struggling to muster troops for a 10,000-strong international stabilization force in Gaza, the keystone of Phase 2, in a 20-point peace plan. Italy is tentatively in, but many nations want their forces parked behind the yellow line, away from zones still controlled by Hamas. With command structure questions unanswered and most offers limited to logistics and funding, the plan's timeline is stuck at a flashing yellow. And drive time relief for millions. Hyundai and Kia will retrofit about 7 million vehicles with zinc-reinforced ignition cylinder protectors to curb the Kia Boys USB theft spree, free for eligible 2011 to 2022 models. The fix, costing over $500 million, comes with up to $9 million in restitution and a new baseline. Future U.S. models must include engine immobilizers. Notices roll out early 2026. The wrench turning runs into early 2027. After years of software patches and steering wheel locks, owners finally get a steal deal. Crime won't start with a simple cable anymore. That's all we have for now. Today's episode was made by Alexander King with GPT-5, Gemini Pro 3, Gemini Flash 2.5, and Google Cloud Text-to-Speech. I hope you have a great day. I'll see you tomorrow, Alex.